can't remember the word, cultivatable acres were there. How many acres could they cultivate out of the total amount of acres? And how productive was that land? What did they know about rotating crops? What did they know about seed development? What did they know about where to plant wheat to get the highest wheat yields versus where to plant corn to get the highest corn yields? And how did all of that develop? So land and the use of land matters to development or changes in living standards over time. In addition, we have a question. Well, you want to think about land just not in terms of farming, though, right? So you want to think about, I'm not sure I'm catching your question very well. No, land's not inclusive with labor. Because we have to think about the factors that changed both how much land there was in the economy, and that's not synonymous with labor, and we have to think about the factors that changed how productive that land was. So crop rotation system changes the fertility of the land, changes the productivity of the land, thereby changes the living standards, has nothing to do with labor. No, land, we think of land as separate from capital, because capital is machines and buildings. Those are things that you can, that are purchased, that are, I'm sorry. Land has an infinite lifespan, it's also not manufactured. So capital are things that are manufactured, people are employed to produce capital, land is not manufactured. Yeah. Sam. So the question Sam has is, why doesn't crop rotation fit into the catch-all A? Let me just say, don't get hung up on whether it's in the A or the T over L. So it's the crop rotation increases, I guess you could think of it as A. It's going to increase the productivity of your land relative to your workers, which is mathematically going to get captured in your A. If you're measuring land as a number of acres, then a crop rotation system which increases the fertility of your land would shift it. That would be caught in the A. If you're measuring your land in some measure of how much output you can get from an acre, so if you sort of incorporate the fertility of the land into your measure, then you'd move along. So probably the more sensible way is to measure it in terms of cultivatable acres, and then it would be in your A. Yep. Yes, K is essentially double counted because K is both an input and an output. That's exactly right. That's right. Well, let me back that up. K is an input. This building is an input. The year it was constructed, it was an output, right? So the investment part, the new additions to capital are an output. The existing capital that existed before the current year is not an output. Yeah. Okay. Now, in addition to agriculture, we also want to recognize that not all capital is privately owned. That when we use a production function that has just K and L in it, we tend to forget that there is government capital as well. And acknowledging the existence of government capital is an important part of understanding U.S. economic history. And so we can take that variable K and we can split it into three pieces, where KP is private capital, which is what we usually think of when we think of just K. That's the privately owned machines and buildings. KG is government capital. And so that includes government-owned buildings and roads and bridges and the like. And then KH is human capital. And that's going to allow us to distinguish between a person who has a low level of skills and therefore has a low level of human capital and another person with a high level of skills and therefore a high level of human capital. So the human capital allows us to say that workers are not equally substitutable one for the other. Some workers have low levels of human capital, low levels of education. Some workers have high levels of human capital. And that also means that we can then talk about development of educational institutions, the increase in educational attainment, and why and how increases in educational attainment contribute to rising living standards over time. KH, the human capital is for any given worker, it's the skills and knowledge embedded in a worker. So you can think about if we have 1 million workers who on average have a 5th grade education versus if we have 1 million workers who on average have a 12th grade education, same amount of L, different amount of human capital. Okay. One more expansion. One more thing. And that's that labor force participation rates matter as well. So if we start from this equation with output being a function of private, government, and human capital, labor, and land, and we can make our little transformation that output per worker is A times some other function of K over P over L, K sub P, over L, K sub G over L, K sub H over L, and T over L. So output per worker depends upon the amount of private capital per worker, the amount of government capital per worker, the amount of human capital per worker, the amount of land per worker. But now I want to look at labor force participation rates. Labor force participation rates are measured as the amount of people in the labor force divided by the population, L over P. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to multiply both sides of this equation by the labor force participation rate, L over pop. And that allows me to say that on the left, Y over L times L over pop gives me output per person. So I'm no longer looking at output per worker, but now output per person, a true measure of material living standards. And that's going to be dependent upon A, that total factor of productivity, and some function that combines the private capital per worker, the government capital per worker, the human capital per worker, the land per worker, and finally the labor force participation rate. That tells me that in addition to all the factors we talked about before, that a higher labor force participation rate is also going to increase average living standards. If we have 70% of the population employed, we're going to have all else constant, we're going to have a higher output per person than if we have 40% of the labor force employed. A higher labor force participation rate produces a higher average output per person. We're going to use that when we talk about post-Civil War. And when we talk about decreases, the effect of decreases in the labor force participation rate. Because following emancipation, there were decreases in the labor force participation rate from people who previously had been enslaved. Through choices to not work as many hours per day, days per week, or weeks per year, to not have women in the fields delivering and then immediately going back and picking cotton hours after they had delivered a baby. And those decreases in labor force participation rate have the predicted effect. You wind up with a drop in average standards of living in the South. But again, back to Sam's question from Tuesday, how are we defining standard of living? As the material standard of living, as the goods and services per worker. So it also helps us to remember that Y is measuring goods and services output stuff. And it's not measuring quality of life issues. That in a broader sense, we might say that the living standards, the quality of life would be a better phrase, that the quality of life may have increased, the output per person went down, but certainly the choice, having the freedom versus being enslaved, that's certainly a quality of life issue if nothing else, is going to offset any drop in output per worker in the combined effect on quality of life. Okay, do I have one more piece? A measures total factor productivity. We've said that. We can think about A as being changing either as a result of exogenous forces or as a result of endogenous forces. When we say that A changes as a result of exogenous forces, we're saying that the changes in A are due to something, I don't have a good word here, something other than all of the other things we just listed. So an exogenous change in A means that the change in A is due to something other than capital to labor ratios. What else did I have? Land to labor ratios, labor force participation rates. So something other than those inputs, a change in those inputs led to a change in total factor productivity. In that case, we say the change in total factor productivity is exogenous. It's not caused by something else, which is part of our story. On the other hand, if the changes in A are themselves due to a change in the capital labor ratio, whether that's private, government, or human capital, a change in the land to labor ratio, a change in the labor force participation rate, then we would call those endogenous changes in total factor productivity. One of the things that you see in 100B is that when there are endogenous forces that can lead to growth in total factor productivity, then you really get fast takeoff growth and you can get divergence between two different economies. A theoretical point that we may or may not touch on again this semester. How does all this relate back to U.S. economic history? Table 3 from Tuesday's handout gives you the data. You look at the effect of labor and capital and land and productivity on economic growth. So this is work that's been done by Dennison to look at how does the total growth of the economy, and here he's looking at total change in Y, not Y over L, how does the change in the amount of output that's produced in the economy, how much of that is due to changes in the quantity of labor, how much is due to changes in the quantity of capital, how much is due to changes in the quantity of land, and how much is due to productivity. The reason that the A was called the solo residual was because mathematically there were ways to calculate these first three numbers. The share of the change in output that's due to a change in the quantity of labor, a change in the quantity of capital, a change in the quantity of land. 100 minus the sum of those first three numbers is the leftover, or the residual, and we say that's the part that is otherwise unexplained. It's what we're going to call the changes due to A, which remember captures everything other than changes in the quantity of inputs. 1840 to 1860 in the antebellum period, almost half of the increase in output is due to increases in labor. Notice 10% of the increases in output are due to increases in land. We have to talk about land acquisition and cultivation. And only 15%, more than zero, but relatively small in historical standards, 15% is due to changes in productivity. On the other hand, when we look at 1940 to 1990, none of the growth in the post-World War II period is due to land. It is what it is what it is. So we don't have increases in the quantity of land after World War II, yet 45% of the increases in living standards and the total amount of output produced in the post-World War II period are due to these increases in productivity. So the changes in productivity are there all the way through. They're particularly important, and we'll talk about this when we get to the third part of the course, they're particularly important in the post-World War II period. This gives us our framework for the semester to talk about what are the sources of these changes in the amount of labor in the economy, what are the sources of the changes in capital, what are the sources of the changes in land, and what are the sources of the changes in productivity. That's a lot. Questions? Yeah. No, productivity stands for the A. Yeah, productivity is the A. Other questions? Yep. Why don't you name? Go ahead. How do they determine it? So they have to make an assumption about the particular mathematical formulation of the aggregate production function, and then they can back out of that the share of, they have data on how much output grew, they have data on how much labor, capital, and land grew. They make an assumption about the mathematical formulation. They use a Cobb-Douglas style production function. I don't know what classes you've had. They use a Cobb-Douglas style production function. They make some reasonable assumptions about the share of labor in total income, the share of capital in total income, the share of land in total income, and that gives them the coefficients on that Cobb-Douglas production function. So now I've got all of my stuff there, and I can mathematically use that. I can't remember exactly how to tell you, but mathematically use that, do a little bit of calculus, and the answers are going to drop out in terms of what share comes from which piece. So growth accounting. Other questions? So what was the point of the expansions? The point was it's sort of, I guess I'm doing development of the history. So the history of thought starts with Bob Solow, who introduces this model. And when he introduces the model, it's 1959 or so. So it's after World War II, and all everybody's thinking about is capital and labor. And they're thinking about private capital, and they're thinking about workers. But to use it to understand economic history, we have to recognize that there's more than just capital and labor. So when people tried to use the model with just private capital and labor to understand economic history, they failed because they weren't taking account of the role of land. They weren't taking account of the role of government capital. They weren't taking account of the role of human capital. So once we incorporate all those other pieces, we get a story that fits better the existing facts. Other questions? Sam? When a city is more densely developed, well, it's going to depend upon what study you're looking at. So some studies are going to treat that as an increase in land, and some studies are going to make a distinction. But in our case, we're going to treat that not as an increase in land. So more dense housing is not going to change the quantity of land. Everything that's not labor, capital, or land goes in A. Okay, any other questions? So let's see how some of these productivity things played out in the early part of our nation's history. So first, a question for you. If I'm making a list here of the things that are part of the cost of production. So I'm going to make a little list. When a business, so think about a business here. When a business is producing something, what's on that list of things that are part of the cost of producing something? Raw materials. Something else. Somebody else. Yep. Wages. So the cost of labor. What else? Yep. Shipping costs. Good. What else? Yep. Rent. If they aren't renting and they own, instead we would put down taxes, utilities. Well, utilities are going to be doing taxes, interest rates. Okay. So rent, taxes, interest rates. Give me another one. Yeah, good. Marketing. Good. What else? Anything else you want to put on the list? Way up high. Overhead capital. Give me some examples of what you mean. All right, cost of machinery. Yep. Maybe insurance. Yep. Storage. Make sure I'm not going out of space. Here's my next one. Storage. What else? I got room for two more. Go ahead. Licensing and permits. How about government regs? Can I clump all that under government regulations? Okay. Way up high. Research. All right. And there may be more. You may have more, but we've captured the big ones, right? We've got labor costs here. We've got the cost of machinery. We've got cost of the building. We've got interest rates for borrowed money, and we've got shipping and insurance. What I want to talk about first is the effect of shipping. So in the early period, so what am I talking about here? I'm actually talking about the colonial period. So this is, I told you I cut almost all the colonial period out. This is it. Listen up. Here we go. 10 minutes. All right. So in the colonial period, shipping costs went way down. Shipping costs went way down for two reasons. One reason that shipping costs, let me back this up. Shipping costs, so the way of transporting goods in the colonial period, so I'm talking 1700s here, the way of transporting goods between what was then the British colonies and Europe, England and the rest of Europe was by ship. The ships would also be used to transport things between the various British colonies, so from the American British colonies down to what's now Jamaica and so on, down to South America. So shipping was the main source of transport of goods in the colonial period. Shipping costs, therefore, were a relatively large part of the cost of production. One thing that led to relatively high shipping costs was that a ship would come into port. So think about the big ships that come in over here at the Port of Oakland, right? A ship comes into port, offloads its cargo, and then the ship has to stay there in port until it's full again. So they don't send a ship from England to Boston and then offload what's in the ship and then turn it back around and send it back empty, right? They bring the ship from Boston to, from England, here we go, sorry, wrong way. From England to Boston, they offload all of the cargo that's on the ship, and then the ship sits there in port for 3 or 4 or however many weeks it takes until there's enough stuff to put on the ship to fill up its cargo hold before it goes on to its next destination. The smaller the total amount of trade, the longer the port time. So the smaller the total amount of trade, the longer the port time. As the American colonies developed, as more people moved here, as more economic activity took place in the British colonies of North America, the port time went down because there was more production happening, more goods being produced, more goods being loaded back onto those cargo ships and shipped off to either other colonies or back over to England. We had a lot of lumber and they didn't, so a lot of things that would get shipped back. And so one of the things that lowered shipping costs was this decrease in the port time, because the more you can transport goods back and forth across the ocean per year, the more money the shipping company is making, flip that over, the less money the shipping company is charging any particular company, it lowers the cost of shipping, given the amount of capital and the amount of labor that's going to increase productivity. So a decrease in port time that comes about as a result of an increase in the quantity of trade winds up as an example of an increase in an increase in productivity that allows for higher living standards because goods cost less because the shipping costs have gone down. A second thing that lowered shipping costs was a decrease in piracy. Particularly here in the early part of the 18th century, the early 1700s, there had been a huge problem with piracy, particularly in the Caribbean. And so the English Royal Navy finally got aggressive. There was some other issues there, but the British Royal Navy got aggressive in terms of ridding the area of piracy, fought the pirates successfully, decreases the amount of piracy in the area. As a result, what happens? Well, if the ship's owners don't have to be worried about pirates, what do pirates do? Pirates come and they take over a ship and they climb on the ship and they take the goods out of the ship, or they take the ship away, right? So if you want to defeat if you're a ship owner and you're worried about pirates, you're going to have cannons on your ship in the 1700s. Because you need to use those to boom, fight the pirates and get rid of the pirates. You're also going to have insurance. So another one of our little factors of production here. You're also going to need to have insurance, because if you own a ship, you're going to insure your cargo against theft. That insurance is going to be pretty expensive when there's a lot of problems with pirates. So when the British Royal Navy is able to put down the piracy, and not eliminate, but close to eliminate the piracy, what happens? The cargo ships, no longer have to have cannons on them. Well, how heavy is a cannon? Really heavy, right? If you're going to have a cannon on your ship, you have to have a pretty sturdy ship in order to make sure the ship doesn't sink when you put the cannons on the ship and all the cannonballs. So remove the cannons from the ship. First off, the ship itself is lighter, and they can build different kinds of ships because they don't have to be able to carry as much weight since they don't have the cannons on them anymore. Tell me about how quickly ships go through water. Does a heavy ship go through water faster or slower than a light ship? Slower. So the lighter the ship, the faster the ship can go. So it takes it fewer days to move across the oceans. The other thing is that insurance comes down and the crew is smaller. You don't need to have as big of a crew if you don't have to have a lot of men there to man the cannons. If you're worried about fighting the pirates, you want to have a whole lot of men on board so that when the pirates try to take over the ship, it's not just you and the captain's assistant saying, oh, please go away. This is not good. No, you got to have a whole lot of people there who can put the cannons in and light the little thing and have the cannon go boom and scare away the pirates. So putting down the pirates increased productivity, which increased living standards. The ships were lighter, smaller crews, faster time, all of which decreases shipping costs, all of which gets captured as an increase in that total factor productivity, all of which increases living standards, all of which means that from now on, oh, wait, I don't have my thing in. Wait. Ha. Whenever you go to Disneyland, you'll think of me. Because Disneyland, my son hates it when I say this. This ride is all economic history. You think it's Jack Sparrow. It's not. It's all about economic history. It's all about the pirates and the effect of the pirates on the cost of shipping. Economic history is everywhere, even in Disneyland. Oh God, Mom, you're really not going to give me that whole economic history thing on this ride, are you? I'm sitting in the back with my cousins. That'd be me. Yeah. The lowering of shipping costs contributes to the higher living standards. No, the same thing. It's the same. So lower shipping costs is the same as saying a smaller cost of supplying the goods. Yeah. Okay. Second piece, productivity in tobacco. So let's talk, instead of shipping and all these wonderful pirates and Disneyland, let's talk about tobacco. With tobacco, instead of having direct evidence about how the changes in productivity came about, with tobacco, we're going to use what we know about economics to reason our way to a conclusion